So that intro right there was from one of the coolest Marvel characters, which is the series we're going through right now, hence the Marvel. If you weren't here last week, and once Rob is back in the office and he uploads the sermon from last week, go listen to it. Amy Kindle did a fantastic sermon with Ant-Man as the theme, so I encourage everyone to go listen to that. But as far as what we have this week, again, one of the coolest Marvel heroes around. And that is Daredevil. It sounds a little sacrilegious to be talking about in church. So this intro video is from Marvel's Daredevil, who, if you love Batman today, like modern day Batman, you have Daredevil to thank for that. Frank Miller, who was not hugged enough as a child, got his big start with Daredevil, and he was not afraid to take it dark. He was very dark. So Daredevil, originally created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett, Daredevil was not afraid to rough up a bad guy just a little bit before death, like breaking legs, breaking arms, all that kind of stuff. He was the first one to leap across rooftops in very awesome poses, like this. Sorry, that's forever now on the internet now because I did that. Where he could pull off superhuman feats with his amazing hand and foot coordination, even though he has no superhuman strength at all, and he could brawl with the best of them, and he protects all of those in Hell's Kitchen, which is this rundown part of New York, which no one cared about, but Daredevil cared about it. But the most defining characteristic of Daredevil is, well, how many of you have not heard of Daredevil before? I'm up here talking about, okay. So, the most defining characteristic of Daredevil is he's blind. He's blind. His inspiration came from that statue of Justice blindfolded, and Stan Lee and Bill Everett wanted to create a superhero who had a disability like that. So even though Daredevil is blind, whenever he had this whatever acid splashed on his eyes when he was a kid, all of his other senses came alive to where smell, sound, touch, even taste melded together to form an even almost better way of seeing. And so in Daredevil, especially the TV series, he calls this seeing a world of fire. So you can kind of see here these glasses he has because he's blind. What he sees through it is that he sees people in this building. He sees the fire inside the building, all because of his super senses. Here's him, how he sees the buildings as he's walking around, just all the smell, touch, taste coming together to see this, and how he sees a person right here is that even though he can't see them with his eyes, everything else about that person is coming to life and now enabling him to see them in this way. So as Daredevil sees this world on fire, not yet, on the world on fire with his strong concern for justice, they call him the man without fear. They call him the devils of Hell's Kitchen. He goes above and beyond for those that nobody cares about who are hurting. So, who's our biblical character? What are some guesses we have out there? Any thoughts? Because we always compare this to a biblical character. What do you think? Clayton, what do you think, Clayton? Clayton's a Daredevil fan, so I'm going to let him, you got a guess here? Paul is a good guess, all right. Any other guesses? Bartimaeus, all right, okay. Any reason why? Blind, yeah, there we are. Any other guesses out there? I heard Jesus just because that's the church answer to say. So, the person I think is Daredevil, we come to his story as he stands on this long road and he has a specific goal in mind. But actually, before we get to his story, I think it's important to know how humans used to see the world. This is all about sight and not seeing, how humans actually used to see the world. So back in creation, in Genesis 1, ancient readers hearing Genesis 1 and seeing the Garden of Eden would have seen all these celestial beings, the stars, the sun, the moon, that they're not just lights in the sky, but they're actually spiritual, divine beings. With Israel understanding that God, who is the true God, set these beings into motion for the purpose of creating a good creation. And God separates the spiritual realm from the earthly realm, separating the waters from the waters, as he says it. But in the midst of this, in the middle of all of this, we have the Garden of Eden. And in the midst of Eden, we have man and woman who are formed from the earth, ground, dirt, but also being given the breath or also in Hebrew, ruach, the spirit of God, of earth and spirit coming together in this garden. Eden, we see, is supposed to be where heaven and earth come together like a temple. So if you read through the Garden of Eden story, you see all this temple language of just how things are designed and centered and created, and specific verbs used, that humans could see God and interact with God and talk with God, and also interact and talk with this dark serpent, all in the same place. And once they're removed from this garden where heaven and earth come together like a temple, the moments of seeing and interacting with the spiritual is rare. But many come to believe that these spiritual forces that we no longer see walking around with us are at work in people's daily lives, and that these spiritual beings are actually over these darker communities, these darker empires, of leading them to worship sex, power, and wealth, and war. That it's these spiritual beings that are causing all these bad things to happen. So humans now no longer able to see the spiritual which they used to walk with daily. So one of my favorite stories, with camp being over, I'm now finally losing my voice. So I'm hoping I can make it through the sermon here. So one of my favorite stories of the spiritual being seen, as probably a lot of people's, comes from 2 Kings chapter 6. So many of y'all probably know this story, where the northern kingdom of Israel, Israel and Judah have split, but they had the prophet Elisha in Israel. And he would regularly send word to the king of Israel about the camps of the Arameans, or the Syrians, as some translations will say. So the king of the Arameans thought, you know what? This is weird. They should not be knowing where we are. We're trying to ambush these people and take everything they have. I have to have some person in my camp that's in the pocket of the king. But one of his officers says, nope, that is not the case because of Elisha. And I like the wording he uses here. He says, Elisha tells the king of Israel the very words you speak from your bedroom. He tries to make it as creepy as possible. So the king overreacts a little bit to capture this lone man. To capture this one person, Elisha, he sends horses, chariots, armored units, and they go by night to surprise them in the morning, all to surround where Elisha lived. And so now comes the part I think everyone is most familiar with. So when the servant of Elisha, the servant of the man of God, as the text says, he gets up in the morning and went out early. And he saw the army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. And he says, "Oh no, my lord," speaking to Elisha, "what shall we do?" The servant asked. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And we love that scene. It's right there in the picture. We love this scene. But I think we stop there. Because as Elisha shares what he sees, which is a world on fire around him, the spiritual realm coming down, but I think what happens at the end of the story is way more amazing. Because as this massive army then approaches Elisha asks God to blind the Arameans. And then he convinces them that the man they're looking for is somewhere else. And so Elisha guides them to Samaria, to the city of the king. And this is the amazing part. Elisha, the one who regularly sees a world on fire, orders the king to not kill them whenever they arrive. And Elisha opens the eyes of the Arameans, and they throw them a great feast. The enemies of Israel weren't enemies anymore. Elisha saw them not as enemies, but people who needed to be freed from the influence of war and hate in their lives. And they went back to their homes, and they no longer raided the Israelite kings. Where the Aramean king thought he had traitors in his midst, now he does have traitors in his midst because of Israelites showing kindness to these people who were just racked by these powers that were unseen. So which opening of the eyes do you think is more miraculous? Is it the servant's? Is it the Arameans? Or is it the king? Which one do you think was more miraculous in that situation? So Elisha and the king's treatments of the Arameans demonstrates a truth that rings clear until today. So how we see people affects them, right? We can kind of be like, duh to that one. But how we see people literally affects who and what they become. How we see people affects who they become, how they behave, how their abilities in general. There's this researcher, his name was Bob Rosenthal. So he had a lab where he would run rats through a maze, classic. But as he was sleeping one night in bed, he had this idea. So he woke up and he went immediately, he snuck into his lab and he started putting signs on all the cages. One cage with a rat, and he kind of just did this indiscriminately. There's no logic behind why he did it. On one cage, he would put intelligent rat. And the other cage, he would put dumb rat. And then he snuck back, went to bed, and the next morning, his researchers came and did what they were supposed to do. They got their rats, and they ran them through the maze. They found that the rats with the intelligent rat sign on their cage did twice as better than those that had dumb rat on their cage. So this researcher found that the way we perceive people, the way we perceive things, actually affects the way they function in life. Our expectations of others change how we treat them, unconsciously or consciously. How we treat them drastically changes how they behave because of that. The words we say, how we say those things, how we touch them, our behaviors around them, our verbal and nonverbal communications, your expectations of others and others' expectations of you literally can make you stronger, smarter, or faster. But those same expectations that you have on others and they have of you can literally make you weaker, dumber, and slower. All from how we perceive and see people. So now I want to ask you, are you being affected by this phenomenon in your life? Is there some other person's perception of you that might literally change the way to be the way you are right now? But then the harder question is, are you affecting somebody this way? Is the way you're perceiving somebody literally changing who they're becoming? One way we see this phenomenon is this man right here. So this man's name is Daniel Kish. So because of Daniel's life, he reaches out, he helps people, he's a social servant. He wants blind people to realize that even though they're blind, they can see. So here Daniel is, he's riding a bike. He started riding a bike at the age of 6, and some of y'all will be like, I was riding a bike at the age of 5. The difference between you and Daniel is that even though he started riding the bike at the age of 6, unlike you, he lost his eyes 3 years earlier to cancer. And he taught himself how to ride a bike. So here's a brief video about Daniel's life and how this happened. So Daniel, as you saw there, doesn't want you to think he's special at all. And it took his mom to kind of say, like, my son is normal. I'm going to let him climb this tree and ride this bicycle for him to kind of break this stigma that we have against people who are blind. Because research shows that your actual the visual cortex in blind people in your brain can stay just as active with that click of the tongue. The visual cortex does not go away. It lights up whenever they do this clicking sound with their tongue that any human can use echolocation, much like a bat or a dolphin. I can see the Salzman boys like later today being like blindfolding themselves, clicking around. So I look forward to the video you have of that later. But Daniel here, Daniel Kish, has seen that through his whole life, even as a kid, that the way we see blind people, believing that they are incapable of surviving without assistance, keeps them from naturally developing this skill. Because they found that blind children, they'll naturally start making this clicking sound or stomping around their environment to try to bring in that information on their own. But we take them away from that. We say this clicking is wrong. We say don't stop. We say you're unsafe when I do this. And we see, consequently, we're keeping them from living a full life where they're fully capable of living on their own. That we see Daniel there. Daniel travels the world in cities he doesn't know without any assistance. He rides bicycles. He goes on hikes. And he can probably hike better than we can because he can hike at nighttime without any type of lamp on his head. But I wonder if we're doing what people do to blind people, that we're doing that on a spiritual level. If we're seeing people as like, they're not worthy. They're incapable. They're wrong. There's something just wrong with them. That we're doing this on a spiritual level to those in our communities. So back to our road. Though Elisha seemed like he was going to be our daredevil, where he saw this world of fire, I think there's one that's a lot closer. So our daredevil, who would soon see the world on fire, he's walking on this road with the desire to cast out, to imprison, and kill all of those who follow the way, Christianity, in Damascus. When all of a sudden he's hit by a great light that shines around him and all those around him, and Saul responds to the voice, to the light, by saying, "Who are you, Lord?" He says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go in the city, and you will be told what you must do." So when Saul then opened his eyes, he was blind. But I often wonder what Saul actually saw. I wonder what he was actually seeing whenever he was blind as we would see it. Because Ananias, the man who would restore his sight after 3 days, was told by Jesus that he would see in a vision, that Saul would see him in this vision. That Jesus said, "Saul is coming to you." He saw you in a vision. So did Saul have other visions? Because at the same time, Jesus also tells Ananias that Jesus is going to show him how much he must suffer for his name. Or did that come later? I wonder what Saul was seeing at this time, because we know whenever Saul opened his eyes that his worldview was drastically different. And I believe that he might have seen the world on fire just like Elisha did, where spiritual forces are present all around, positive and negative. Because later on in Acts, we hear more from Saul about this event. And now he goes by the name of Paul. His account of events where Jesus tells him from the blinding light, "I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the powers of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." That Paul is teaching people how to see, just as he was taught how to see the world in a different way. Paul sees the world differently. He sees everyone as loved by God. He sees that there are dark influences that can change a person's life. He was blind, and now he truly sees. So I would like for us now to put ourselves in Paul's sandals here. Not his shoes, he wore sandals. Thinking about where Paul used to see. How Paul used to see people from his own worldview. I don't know what's happening here. All right. How Paul used to see people, how he used to see the world, driven by his own perception of how things needed to be. And then what Jesus might have shown him. What might have happened those 3 days where Paul went from one worldview to this third worldview. And think about how Saul saw people after that. So I'd like to invite you now to close your eyes. Close your eyes. Become blind right now. We're going to hear some words of Paul's letters to the Corinthians, the Ephesians, and Philippians as we listen to this song.
things God has prepared for those who love him. These are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit.
So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.
Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.
Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you.
So we are always confident, even though we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
You can open your eyes. I can't help but think that Paul had this experience with Christ in mind as he shared with these churches that he loved. And I don't think we have to have this supernatural gift that Elisha had or that Paul might have had, because who was our biblical daredevil, to see this world on fire. Because simply put, Paul went from a person who saw others from his distorted view of the world with his own expectations, but God saw him differently and truly opened his eyes around him. Paul saw people differently. He didn't see people as a result of even their own choices and actions, but as people who are constantly being bombarded by the spiritual forces that are seeking to pull them away from the grace of God. Jesus and what he did on the cross gives us that gift. Jesus brings us back into Eden, where we can commune with God and see God and all the people around us, bringing the kingdom into our daily lives. Paul sees a world on fire. He sees the fires of destruction from evil, but also the purifying, life-giving fire of God. He sees how the forces of evil can oppress, enslave, and destroy all of God's people, but he sees how God can roar through a community like a raging fire, casting out darkness and creating communities that show the kingdom of love, grace, and justice. So how do you see people? How do you see people in your world? Because how you see people, much like we saw with that rat experiment, or how Daniel Kish sees his fellow blind people being treated, how we see people can literally change their lives. Jesus speaks to you from the light, as he did with Paul, when we persecute his sons and daughters, when we see people as flawed instead of someone affected by outside forces, by family, by circumstances, by the world, by spiritual powers, but not see them as people who are deeply loved by Christ in the midst of all those failures that they have. The way Paul's sight was restored led us to the church we are today in this building in Boulder, Colorado. And Jesus calls you to that same glory from the light. So who in your life are you seeing as broken, as flawed, as a lost cause, as annoying, as dumb? Who are you seeing as unworthy? Because let's see them like a world on fire. Let's see them as Paul does. Let's pray. God, we come before you and we ask you to open our eyes, God. That it's easy for us to see others as the world wants us to see them, as people who are broken or driven by means of money and success and power. But God, open our eyes and see that these people are affected by more than their own decisions and choices. God, help us to show them the love that you showed Paul. Help us to show them the love that Paul showed all the others that were broken and needed to hear your good word. It's to your Son's name we pray. Amen.